Thanks, everybody. So just in the spirit of sharing, I just want to reiterate that some of what I said yesterday. I've been working on the Great Barrier Reef, and my main research priority is to understand threats to the Great Barrier Reef and particularly the coral habitats. And I've been doing this for sort of 30 years, so I am a JCU graduate, very much focused on the area in our immediate vicinity. And if we think about the holistic threats to the Great Barrier Reef, one of the ones which probably doesn't get a lot of attention, but we need to consider, is the fact that there is actually a coral harvest fishery operating within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and World Heritage Area, as occurs across all the coral reef jurisdictions in Australia, including the Coral Sea Marine Park. So to give you a flavour of the scale and extent of this, we've been harvesting corals, the industry's been harvesting corals from the Great Barrier Reef since very early on in the 1950s. A large part of that was initially for curios, and this is an ongoing part of the current collection, but it's a very minor part. The key thing now is to provide corals for aquariums, and this is largely an export industry. So the value proposition that goes with this fishery is very much contingent upon having that export approval to allow for the export of corals, which are on CITES Appendix 2, so that has to comply with a lot of additional regulations. In terms of the scale of the fishery, the latest estimates suggest that there's around 55 million organisms harvested and largely traded internationally on an annual basis, and the estimated value of this industry globally is around 2.5 billion. More closer to home, the last estimate that was undertaken for the Queensland Coral Fishery was around $37 million per year. So the total allowable catch for the commercial coral harvest in Queensland, just focusing in on the Great Barrier Reef, is 200 tonnes. Now, that's that blue line you can see at the very top of that graph, and the blue dots indicate the actual proportion of that quota that are taken on an annual basis. And so you can see we're very far from ever harvesting anything like that amount, but it has in some years exceeded 100 tonnes. It's important to point out that is split into specialty coral. There's a lot of sort of history associated with why we have these two categories, but there was the specialty coral, which is all the generally large polyp things, and then the other coral, which are the faster growing sort of Acropora and Poecilopora. So the harvest is still well below the legislated harvest limits, but the important thing that we need to acknowledge is that there has been a massive escalation in the amount of harvesting, and that's not really apparent from this because one of the issues we have in this industry is inconsistent reporting based on size or weight of the pieces of coral. And so you can see it much more clearly if we look at the actual number of pieces that are taken from the Great Barrier Reef. So critically, there was a real upswing in the level of harvesting in around 2016, 2017, and most of you will be well aware that that coincided with the massive mass bleaching and corresponding coral mortality on the Great Barrier Reef. And so you can imagine this really raised some alarms among international CITES partners who were wondering how you could really reconcile that massive increase in harvest at the same time. There's widespread reports that the Great Barrier Reef is being subject to, significant pressure from climate change. And so that was the crux of the issue, and I need to talk through some of the sort of governance issues for really explaining why some of the industry members weren't really privy to the pressures that the whole industry was under early enough in this discussion process. So just to give a little bit more context, some of the corals that are being harvested by the Queensland Coral Fishery are incredibly unique. They don't generally they feature in much of the large-scale monitoring because a lot of this stuff is harvested from deep water or interreefal habitats. Some of these things are incredibly unique in the sense that the coral there on your right, Homophilia australis, it's probably not that species and it's probably not that genus. It's probably an unknown coral. It's undescribed at this point. Probably only grows in one small area off Mackay. Doesn't grow anywhere else in the world. It's an Australian endemic, and we're literally taking, you can see the numbers there, around 40,000 of them off the reef on an annual basis. So, you know, there's a real imperative to look at the conservation of these corals. So just to give you a sense of the sort of the governance and talk about what the existing instruments are in terms of managing this. And that number there is pretty critical, the 269% increase in the harvest of Trachophilia, because up until the recent management reforms, Queensland Fisheries had a legislative instrument in place which said if you increased your harvest by 30% in any given year, there had to be a suspension on take and a thorough review of what was going on. And that wasn't happening. And even for the Homophilia australis, we saw relatively unconstrained and unregulated growth over a period of several decades. So the problem is, you know, inherent in a lot of this management is that the governance is incredibly complicated. So from the industry perspective, they're largely constrained in their activities by the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, who are on one part responsible for issuing the licences and also for managing the quota requirements. So those quota requirements are supposed to be reviewed annually, but, you know, in terms of that structure I just presented in terms of the 200 tonnes, it's been unchanged since 2005. Now, in addition to that, and this is going to be a very simplistic view of the governance that, you know, is imposed upon the licence holders, they also, because it's a part of the harvest fishery, they also have to independently get a permit to operate from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. And so they have to directly interact with the Marine Park Authority in that way. The other thing is, because this is a CITES, they're targeting something that's on CITES, there's also a lot of oversight from the Commonwealth Agency through DQ, and in particular the department that's responsible for operating as Australia's CITES Scientific Authority. Now, there's a lot of exchange between QDAF and DQ in terms of what happens on a sort of a 3-year cycle associated with what we call the World Trade Operations Authority. That's when a lot of the action happens, and you can see for, you know, this is really timely because the WTO, the current WTO in place, expires in October of this year. And so there's going to be a lot of back and forth. Interestingly, that exchange is all through QDAF and DQ. The industry are not privy to, largely not privy to this whole exchange of information. Now, what happens in the lead up to this is DQ often seeks independent expert advice, and this is where I came in. I actually have been providing the necessary analysis of all the data to support the last range of WTOs, the last one which came into place for the Coral Sea earlier this year. And then the further complication is that Australia's CITES Authority are constantly having to receive inquiries and respond to the inquiries from the international CITES authorities. And we like to think of this as sort of, you know, a really strong structured process, but really every single country that signs into CITES interacts with the other countries individually. So Australia is receiving requests for information simultaneously from all the receiving countries of our exports and have to respond to those. And the industry, let alone, you know, the independent experts, are not privy to any of those requests. So we sort of, you know, have this really strange filter through which we see the information, where we're asked to provide input and information without really knowing the genesis or the real reason for those concerns. And not surprisingly, therefore, in recent history, some of this has really sort of blown up and created a real constraint on the social licence to operate. So one of the things that has really changed recently, that there was a push to put in place prescribed harvest limits. Okay, now this is part of the WTO process. It was imposed by DQ, but it had to be done in accordance with the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries harvest strategy. So we're working with two completely separate requirements to try and come together and create what we thought were going to be appropriate harvest limits. And I was tasked with doing this job, so it was a really interesting process, in the sense that I was thought the minute that this was contracted, I would be able to just go and get the information from DAF. It actually took over a year even to get the harvest data out of DAF before we could even start that process. So just the key bits about the harvest process. The idea was to set harvest limits based on a reference period. There's a lot of issues around that reference period. It's very contemporary, really. And also there was a tiered approach. So just to show you how this works for this coral I showed you previously, we have a 3-year reference period. It was averaged by that. And then you have this multiplier based on the tier. And this particular coral at the time was considered tier 2, so they could harvest 1.5 times the mean harvest for the reference period. So obviously that allows for a 50% increase in the harvest levels over and above the elevated reference levels, which are already elevated above what really the history of harvesting for this coral really was. So there was obviously a bit of an issue there. And the key thing about this harvest strategy was it really was doing very little to constrain the growth of the harvest. So the fundamental concern here that was being put upon us by the international CITES partners was that there was evidence of uncontrolled, unregulated growth in this sector, which we had to address. So we went through and considered all the different corals and tried to come up with prescribed harvest limits for all those different corals. And considered everything above where there was more than 600 kilos harvested per year, and then looked at the catch trends. It's a lot involved in this, but those documents are now publicly available, so you just need to type in, go to the sort of CITES authority, and you can see the expert assessments for all the different Australian jurisdictions' coral fisheries. So this was the ultimate take-home from all of this. I'm pleased to say that this was our recommendations ended up being fully endorsed by the Minister at the time, Susan Lee. And, for various people, you'll be interested in the different limits. I guess the one that's relevant in terms of the context of a lot of the discussions this week in terms of restoring populations, where a lot of the focus of restoration is on Acropora, is the fact that the industry is permitted to take in the order of 100,000 pieces of Acropora with a total weight of around 1,900 kilos. Just try and put that in the perspective of what you guys are trying to produce and put back out there on the reef. So in terms of setting these limits, we were compelled to deviate from the Queensland harvest strategy. We thought it was it was very difficult to justify that further 50% increase, so we constrained our upper limit to 100% or a multiplier of 1 relevant to the reference levels. So for all the corals of concern, even those ones which come out as relatively low concern, it's a maximum of 100% of that reference level. These prescribed harvest limits ended up being endorsed unanimously and were put in place and became, in order to enact that, they became part of the WTO conditions. They aren't sitting in legislation within the QDAF management of the quota. As far as QDAF are concerned, the quota for the fishery is still that 200 tonnes split between specialty and other coral, but then they have to honour this additional complication which comes over the top. Now, when this was first put in place, there was an unfortunate race to fish where everyone was told, this is your harvest limit. As soon as we hit that harvest limit, you can't take it anymore. So a lot of the licence holders went out and tried to game the system and said, okay, we think the Trachophilia are going to go first, and they just targeted that. Others went for the Homophilia and just targeted that. As you could imagine, we went way over the quotas. I'm happy to advise now that even these quotas are now subject to an individual tradable quota. So each licence holder within their quota allocation has been given a proportionate level to harvest each of these different coral species. The key thing is this is the first species-specific harvest limits imposed for corals within this fishery. So we're trying to rein in the amount that can be taken on any given coral. Up until this was put in place, up to depending on which quota, which coral you were looking at, up to 140 tonnes could be taken of a single species in a single year. But the key thing to emphasise is these limits are based on catch history. They are not necessarily sustainable. Okay, so in terms of understanding the CITES oversight on this, this is a structure that we've actually developed in order to talk to the current levels of data availability and the way we need to set harvest limits. This is brand new because there has never been a consistent framework for really establishing what you need to set a harvest limit within CITES. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I just want to point out that as far as we're concerned, this is where the Queensland Coral Fishery is sitting, where there is comprehensive spatial temporal catch effort data. There's a little bit of knowledge around the species, but there's a lot of information they need before we can even consider setting sustainable harvest limits. So these should be very, very precautionary harvest limits. The data needed to take that further is dependent on the volume of the trade and the intrinsic and extrinsic threats. So there's a requirement now under CITES that if you've got high levels of trade, you need to go to the next level. So based on what we know about the fishery, we really need to be down here now. So you can understand that there's probably a big gap there. And not surprisingly, the EU has imposed bans on the import of Australian corals. This is just one of a number of bans that Australia is currently subject to. So this plays out where they get their scientific reference group to then come to opinion, and they made a negative opinion about these corals. All right, so what do we have to do? Given the heavily reliance on fisheries and data, we need open and transparent and readily accessible data. It's unbelievable in this day and age that a lot of this catch data is almost inaccessible. We need detailed information on the catch composition. So for Acropora, you report it at the genus level. We have no idea of the catch composition, what proportion is from different species. We need information on the distribution, abundance, and especially biomass. This is a weight-based quota. It's actually hard to take all the information we know about how much coral is out there and actually turn it into a biomass. So that's where we've invested our last 2 years, is just working that out. We need to compare sampling. We need to undertake the sampling in fished and unfished areas. You can understand immediately the ramifications of that. And we need ongoing sampling to understand the stock status in the face of constant environmental change. So the take-home messages: it's difficult to justify the substantial increases in the harvest level given the additional pressures to which the reef's been subject. The prescribed harvest limits were intended to address unconstrained and unregulated growth, but they are not necessarily sustainable harvest limits, and a lot of work's needed. And the thing is establishing those sustainable harvest limits requires a massive investment, and it doesn't seem we're going to get there. So, you know, we've got to be open to what's the other avenue for this fishery. And I think the key take-home is that the Australian marine aquarium industry needs to reduce reliance on wild stocks. If they're going to maintain exports of Australian high-value and unique corals, it's got to be done through aquaculture. And I implore anyone within the RRAP aquaculture team to think about some of these Australian endemic corals. They are extremely valuable, and we need to start thinking about the aquaculture of these species. Thanks very much.
No, well, you're out of time, but that was such a great talk. I'm sure there'll be one or two questions, so... You want to come up?
What would you estimate the industry to be worth a year?
Well, there was that estimate, but that comes just from the total revenue acquired, which was $37 million. But, you know, even that is probably a gross underestimate. But I think, you know, it's beholden on an industry like that to reinvest in its own future. And so there's probably a need for sort of, you know, some proportion of that to go back into the research required to prop this industry up.
Anything from the Slido or the where are we looking? Line up for questions or?
Morgan, are any of these species of great concern listed by IUCN on their red list? I know they're not listed under Australian legislation because I chaired the Threatened Species Scientific Committee for 12 years and we've never heard of it, but I'm just wondering about IUCN.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of they vary enormously under which they're listed. but some of them are considered vulnerable, and there's a whole range that are at least concerned. My concern with that assessment is that it's often assumes that a lot of these species have a global distribution. So for that, Homophilia australis, it was originally considered it was a part of a broader species complex that's spread across large parts of the coral triangle. But if you recognise it as a unique species that's only found off Mackay, you've got to do a whole new assessment. So we need to revisit all those assessments.
Okay, maybe you and I need to have a conversation about how that might be done. Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, how does Australia compare to other countries in their management and that data collection element for wild take coral?
Yeah, it's a really good question to put the Australian management of coral fisheries into the global context. It's hugely varied, and I'll say, we do better than some and worse than others. The real travesty, I think, is that Australia for a long time was the global leader in managing these fisheries, and we probably took our eye off the game and took a lot for granted, and now we really do have to catch up. And the obvious thing is, if we don't invest in this and really work out what the sustainable harvest limits are and be on the real front foot in doing this properly, then the obvious alternative is just to shut it down.
Out of curiosity, what's the date when we were last best practice?
Oh, yeah, well, it's an ever-changing sort of situation. I think, a real shift in the whole process happened, unfortunately, just as we're entering into the COVID era. So it actually took a long time for the scientific reference group in the EU to actually pass down their recommendations. But Australia has been really in the limelight since around 2018. And we didn't really make the necessary changes in the underlying management policies to keep up since that time. So there's a lot to do.